No matter what time period you live in, one thing is certain. You would die, eventually. But how? The Stone Age. The Stone Age is the first period in a three-age system, and surprise, surprise, it gets its name from the fact that nearly all the tools used back then were made of stone. The Stone Age lasted for around 3.4 million years, and in that time, the early humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to practicing agriculture. If you lived in the time when hunting and gathering was all the rage, there's a high chance you would die doing just that. Picture this. It's nearly dinner time, so you pick up your tools and head to your preferred hunting ground. You come across a bison and go in for the kill. But considering the animal's size and strength, you end up getting killed instead. The outcome would probably be the same if you had come into contact with a mammoth or any other large animals. If you lived in the time when agricultural practices had become commonplace, I hate to break it to you, but your life would still be very much in danger. Rearing animals was one of the most common practices, and you know what can happen when you get up close and personal with animals? You guessed it, you'd probably catch something, and if you somehow managed to survive hunting accidents and contagious animal diseases, your diet would probably kill you. The people back then knew nothing about nutrient deficiencies, and they didn't exactly have a wide range of options where food was concerned. That is, assuming you were able to get any food at all. The Bronze Age. You've probably heard of the Black Death. If you haven't, it was a really scary bubonic plague pandemic that wiped out almost 50% of Europe's 14th century population. Around 50 million people lost their lives to the Black Death, making it one of the most fatal pandemics in human history. But the truth is, the Black Death was not the bubonic plague's first rodeo. The bubonic plague has actually been around since the Bronze Age, and that's when it struck for the first time. It was by the bite of infected fleas, or by coming in contact with an infected person. So basically, no one was safe. If you didn't catch the bubonic plague while living in the Bronze Age, you would still have to contend with diseases like tuberculosis and other malaria. Like the Stone Age, the Bronze Age gets its name from the fact that people in this era had started making tools with bronze. Unfortunately, they had also discovered the art of war, and had started making some pretty dangerous weapons. The human population had increased significantly at this point, and more people meant higher chances of conflict, which brings us to another likely cause of death. You would go to war, bronze sword in hand, with only a 50% chance of making it out alive. That is, assuming you aren't walking right into an ambush. Away from all the fighting, an increase in population also means more mouths to feed. The people in the Bronze Age were heavily dependent on agriculture, and unfortunately, crop failure was pretty common back then. If your community experienced crop failure for an extended period of time, death by starvation would come knocking. The Iron Age. When the Iron Age rolled around, humans had begun to make tools and weapons with iron and steel. Frankly, the Iron Age wasn't very different from the Bronze Age. I mean, sure, there was a lot of new technology, and many Bronze Age civilizations collapsed to make way for new ones. But in terms of causes of death, things were pretty much similar. So, how would you die in the Iron Age? Statistically speaking, there's at least a 33% chance that you wouldn't even make it past infancy. Every third or maybe even second child died young, and it was common for the woman who made it to childbearing age to die during childbirth. If you weren't a woman, you still wouldn't be off the hook, because by this time, wars had become more common and perhaps more deadly. In recent years, scientists have found some naturally mummified bodies of people who lived in the Iron Age, and the one thing they all had in common is that they died really gruesome deaths. One of such naturally preserved bodies was found near Manchester, England, and upon examination, it was discovered that he had been hit over the head and whipped with ropes before having his throat slit like he was some Game of Thrones character. If you lived in this time period, that could have easily been you. If you somehow made it past all the risk factors so far, you would still have to worry about diseases. Trade was a thing at this point, which means diseases like measles and tuberculosis could spread far and wide. In the Iron Age, communities still relied heavily on growing their own food. And so, if you lived in a community that was prone to experience crop failure, either as a result of natural disasters or infertile soil, your days would be numbered. The Medieval Period. The medieval period began in the 5th century and lasted until the 15th century. Much of this time is often referred to as the Dark Ages, and honestly speaking, it's easy to see why. In this period, just about anything could kill you. For starters, childbirth hasn't gotten any less dangerous, and so women were still dying trying to give birth. Even Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, passed away shortly after giving birth, and she was royalty. The babies born didn't fare any better than their mothers. Say you were among the lucky few who didn't die during childhood. Well, congratulations! That simply means you will live to experience the Black Death. Remember that really scary bubonic plague pandemic I talked about earlier? The one that wiped out over 50 million people worldwide? Yeah, that one. If you lived in the medieval period, all it would take for you was to come into contact with an infected person who just so happens to sneeze in your direction. And that's it. A few days later, you would be standing in front of the pearly gates. Speaking of the pearly gates, nearly everybody who was anybody, including kings, missionaries, crusaders, and merchants, had accepted Christianity, and they were all determined to see if the rest of the world would do the same. If you resisted the generally accepted beliefs and religious teachings, well, hello heresy accusations and subsequently death. Apart from the bubonic plague, living in the medieval era meant you had to worry about a whole bunch of other diseases. Of course, there was also famine, hunting accidents, and war. Even traveling was considered a major cause of death. There's no denying that the whole world had it tough during this era. But you know who was really going through it? Africans. At this time, the horror that was the slave trade had started to become more mainstream. So if you were African, there's a high chance you would have been among the millions of people who were taken from their homes and subjected to hell on earth. The early modern era. Now we're getting closer. The early modern era started out somewhere between the 15th and 16th century and ended somewhere between the 18th and 19th century. Historians around the world can't seem to agree on the exact time, so let's go with that. In this era, the mortality rate was still pretty high and was believed to be equal for men and women, so you would be damned either way. To begin with, the chances of making it past the age of 1 were still pretty slim. If you somehow made it, you would better hope your family was wealthy, because if they weren't, well, hello, food shortages and malnutrition, which, by the way, were also the leading causes of death in this era. If you did come from a poor background, the one thing you shouldn't do while trying to make ends meet is turn to a life of crime. Capital punishment had become very gruesome in this era. Criminals and people accused of being criminals were shown no mercy and were executed in the most gruesome manner imaginable. One of such methods involved tying the accused person to a wheel, breaking their limbs, and then rolling the wheel down a hillside covered in thorny bushes. Now, if you're extremely lucky and you manage to stay out of trouble and somehow survive the food shortages and childbirth risks, you would have to contend with diseases and other health hazards. The early modern era isn't exactly known for being super hygienic, and so it's no surprise that certain areas were plagued by local epidemics like dysentery, smallpox, typhoid fever, and cholera. Even the bubonic plague made a deadly appearance at some point. If you think calling the doctor would save you, think again, because the medical practitioners in this era were really just winging it. They engaged in practices like trepanation, which involves drilling a hole into a person's skull as some sort of treatment and bloodletting, which, let's face it, only made the patient worse. Modern era. Welcome to the present. Depending on who you ask, the modern era stretches from 1800 AD to the present, or from the period following the end of World War II in 1945 to this day. If you were around in the early 20th century, that means you would be just in time for World War I. World War I started in 1914 and ended in 1918, claiming the lives of around 20 million civilians and military personnel. If you managed to survive the war, you still wouldn't be safe because you know what started in 1918, just months before the war came to an end? That's right, the Great Influenza Epidemic, aka the Spanish flu outbreak. The virus responsible for this disease infected roughly 1/3 of the world's population at the time and caused around 50 million deaths worldwide. Needless to say, if you were around back then, there's a really high chance you would have become casualty number 50,000,001. In this era, you simply can't catch a break because just years after the Great Influenza Epidemic ended, along came World War II in the year 1939. This time, 75 million people lost their lives. If you're here, you're probably a millennial or Gen Z, which means you weren't around when any of this went down. So, what lies ahead for you? If the current political climate is anything to go by, you just may end up getting enlisted for World War III. That's it for this video. See you in the next one.